Good morning. Wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to see old friends. We had dinner last night, watched the basketball game, and I look forward to meeting new friends today. I learned recently that the word expert comes from the Latin expertus, which means one who has experience. No? And so I think, as Clark was saying earlier, we're all the experts that are gathered here. So I'm so happy that you have come, and we trust that the Holy Spirit is present with us and will be present in our conversations and lead us to new insights that are going to be helpful to young people. No? That's the whole purpose that we're gathered here today. I too want to add my word of admiration to Clark and Kristen and Jim and Pete and the important work that you're doing with Play Like a Champion today. Clark Power here at Notre Dame has been a model for me and a mentor to me, and I think to many other people, about how our thinking in higher education can really attempt to engage the society which we live in, no? And help us to move toward more kinship, no? More of a understanding that we belong to one another, but also that our society might become a place where young people can flourish. So I'm very grateful to Clark for his influence. In 1878, a student author for the Georgetown College Journal provided an account of the athletic sports that took place at the school's annual field day. Now, at the time, the students at Georgetown College would have been high school aged and younger, as was true of other Catholic colleges in the 19th century. The first event he described was the hurdles, in which he reported that Chu made a graceful finish in the unprecedented time of 1 second, but unfortunately he made it at the very first hurdle, which proved to be his pons asinorum, and over which he executed a double somersault, which would have kindled enthusiasm in the heart of the average showman. It was clear who was to come in first and second, so the student reports that all the excitement centered in who should bear off the honors of the rear. It looked like Walsh might do so, but then he made a sudden spurt and shot by the other runners. His flight was a short one, however, when on one of the last hurdles, he was observed to fall like a shooting star and strike a graceful and becoming attitude upon his head. Whether he assumed this position in the wild exhilaration of the moment, or whether he was forced to it by the attraction of gravity, we cannot say. In another event, the tug of war, one of the Lawler brothers on one end would from time to time turn completely around and put the rope over his shoulder, damaging to a great extent the efforts of Condi Palin just next to him, who, being considerably smaller in stature, was sometimes observed dangling in midair, while at other times the sudden depression of the rope would reveal him in a sitting posture, whence the elevation would again relieve him, making his whole performance look something like that of a puppet worked by means of a string. McManus pulled with steady earnestness, meanwhile, his face exhibiting that expression of intense agony mingled with hope, often to be seen in the representations of the early Christian martyrs. In the student journalist's description of the Grease pig race, during which students tried to catch a pig that had been let loose in the field, the author informed his readers how the pig ended up stuck among cartwheels and stumps and other objects. Then, he writes, in our efforts to disentangle him, he would suddenly rush at us with a perfect crescendo of squeals, attempting an occasional nib at our calves in a way not altogether conducive to social feeling. The pig disappeared in the crowd, but soon emerged dragging little Henry Tosada after it at a wondrous rate of speed, so that a grave doubt arose in our minds whether Henry had the pig or the pig had Henry. But as the prize was awarded to the boy, and as the pig was not even mentioned as second, we can confidently assert that Henry won the race. Now, 12 years earlier, in an article entitled Amusement, Their Uses and Abuses, leading Congregationalist pastor Washington Gladden had painted a very different picture. As he reflected on his childhood, he lamented the fact that his own Christian upbringing had led him to think that playing sports was sinful, or that if he did play them, he should do so with the utmost seriousness. As he put it, "In my boyhood, I used to think that if I became a Christian, it would be wrong for me to play ball. Or if I engaged in the sport, I must do so in a serious and thoughtful way, with none of the hilarity and abandon which made the ball ground so attractive to me. If I had become a Christian, then I am sure I should have felt bound to repress all my boyish exuberance of spirits, and my conscience would have reproached me for engaging in any pastime which gave it vent. Yet doubtless the boyishness that was in me would have proved stronger than those mistaken convictions of duty, and I should have presented the common, though somewhat paradoxical, spectacle of a human being committing sin in doing that which is perfectly right." Washington Gladden's anxiety surrounding play and sport and the broader Puritan-influenced religious heritage that was associated with such concern at this time is well known among scholars of the history of sport and recreation in the United States. But the kinds of experience discussed of the students at Georgetown, a Jesuit Catholic college, which were commonplace at Catholic schools in the 19th century United States, and the religious and ethical sensibilities that provided the context within which they could have occurred, has been neglected in the studies of sports history. This neglect is due in part to a larger problem within the writing of the history of sport. A common narrative in the field tells the story of Catholicism as a religious tradition that loathes the flesh. This is most often expressed when scholars write about play and sports in medieval and early modern Europe, an era in which it's hard to ignore the influence of the Catholic faith on people's attitudes and cultural traditions. For some scholars, the loathing of the flesh meant that the Catholic Church only had a negative influence on the development of sport and recreation during these earlier periods, either through lack of encouragement or explicit condemnation and prohibition. Other scholars who acknowledge the extent of play and sport during medieval, early modern periods attempt to understand these realities apart from any explicit Catholic influence. According to a common way of telling the story in the field, the Puritans in the 16th and 17th centuries loathed the flesh more than the Catholics allegedly did, and added a suspicion of play which intensified negative attitudes towards sport. This changed in the later 19th century and early 20th century when Protestant Christians, often called muscular Christians in England and the United States, began to embrace the body in sport. For some scholars, it was not changed religious attitudes, but the rise of secularism that most influenced the development of sport in the modern world. So within this way of telling the story, Catholic acceptance of sports in the United States had to do merely with going along with something that was increasingly popular and had little, if anything, to do with the religious or the ethical tradition itself. This approach, however, is not able to account for the fact, these are things that we're learning, especially with the development of something called social history, which studies lives of ordinary people in daily life. We know now that during the medieval period and into the early modern period, Catholics were playing sports on feast days and holy days throughout the year. And these feast days and holy days made up as much as a third of the yearly calendar. So that's a lot of time. Some scholars point out, too, that girls and women were participating as they did in the agricultural economy. So here's a quotation from William Baker, his book, Sports in the Western World. Baker points out that the Puritans opposed the recreational life of the masses of Englishmen precisely because it was geared to the Catholic Church calendar. No? So he's a different way of reading this history. And he points out that various saints' days, the 12 days of Christmas, Easter, etc., all were occasions for people to play football and stool ball and engage in running and jumping contests, etc. So play and sports were also introduced into the first schools that were primarily for lay people in the 15th century starting in Italy, the schools of the humanists, in the Renaissance, became a part of the school day of kids in those schools, and also the early Jesuit schools. And by the end of the 18th century, the early Jesuits had 800 schools in Europe and other parts of the world, so that was an important influence on education. These activities were also depicted in the religious art of these earlier periods. So here's a stained glass window from Gloucester Cathedral from 1350. They call it the golfer, but golf hadn't been invented yet, so it's some other sport involving a ball and a stick. This is from the same cathedral. This is called a mercy seat. You can lift this seat up so the monks could stand while sitting, some of the older monks. And underneath, they had depictions of daily activities, including many of sports. This is a prayer book from France. Around 1300, you find many of these kind of images of people at play in prayer books during this period. This is the same prayer book here. So I think the approach that I was describing earlier, that way of telling the story, also doesn't seem to be aware of the ways in which the material world and the human body were taken seriously by Christian theologians in these earlier periods. One of the things that's mentioned in the document is that, starting with Irenaeus in the 2nd century, but also even someone like Augustine and then Thomas Aquinas, some of the main arguments that they were engaged in would do with the Gnostics and the Manichaeans, and they centered around the material, how to understand the material world. No? And the Christian theologians were insisting on the goodness of the material world because God created it, as we see in the 1st chapter of Genesis. No? And also that the body was constitutive of what it means to be a human being. No? And so then it also made sense that the body would be involved in the religious practices because the person is a composite, as Bishop Hying was saying. No? Throughout this period, the religious practices were very embodied activities. If we think of pilgrimages, if we think of even something like medieval drama, the use of holy water, incense, using statues in prayer or images, or the sacraments themselves, which make use of the material things of this world. The document grounds its interest in sport in an understanding of the person as a unity. So here's a quotation from Montaigne, who was a humanist writer in the 16th century. This is something he wrote about education. And I'm having a little trouble reading that screen in the back, so I'll have to read here. Montaigne says, we're not bringing up a soul, we're not bringing up a body, we're bringing up a person. We must not split him into two. The sense of the unity of the person. This is the reason that he gives for including games and sports in the school day of the young people, because we're bringing up a person. I mean, he wants his physical dexterity, he says, right, to be molded step by step with his soul. The document also points out that the acceptance of play and sport in the medieval period and later, the schools that came later, had to do with what I'll call a play ethic, a certain way of understanding what virtue is. For Thomas Aquinas, he asked the question, can there be a virtue about games, in his Summa Theologica. And for Thomas, he answers yes, and the reason he answers yes is because virtue for him has to do with moderation, that we shouldn't be excessive in any area. And that would include with regard to work or with regard to study. So he says, I pray spare yourself at times, for it becomes a wise person to sometimes relax the high pressure of his attention to work. That's actually a quote from Augustine. Now this relaxation comes in playful words and deeds, he says. Therefore it becomes a wise and virtuous person to have recourse to such things at times. So for Thomas, play itself, far from being sinful, it's an integral part of a fully human life, and even the way he understands a virtuous life. The problem comes when we use play in the wrong way, right? So for him, one of the ways it can become sinful is if it's injurious to myself or to other people. But Thomas also says, and this is maybe surprising in our context, that it's also possible to sin by having a lack of play in one's life. So for him, sin is against reason, integrally considered, and he says it's against reason for a person to be burdensome to others by offering no pleasure to others and by hindering their enjoyment. Now, I've been a priest for coming up on 20 years, and I've yet to hear someone come to the sacrament of reconciliation and say, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I have too little play in my life." You know? It seems that we have a different way of understanding sin than Thomas did. Maybe something good to think about during Lent, no? For Thomas, while play relaxes the pressure associated with work, play doesn't have its significance in relation to work. So it's not the pause that refreshes so that I can get back and be more productive. Rather, he insists that play is engaged in for its own sake. He says, nothing further is sought than the soul's delight. Now, he responds to the objection that play cannot be virtuous because every virtuous act is directed toward an end by saying that the enjoyment of play is directed to the recreation of the human person. The end of play is the human being. We might think of the human being fully alive, no? It calls to mind Irenaeus' statement, which Bishop Hine quoted, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. No? So play maybe gives glory to God sort of indirectly through the human person. And maybe for our purposes, we could adapt that a little bit and say the glory of God is the young person fully alive. So Thomas's ethic exercised an influence on direct influence on the humanists and early Jesuits. They drew on this way of thinking when they started their schools and decided to include time for play and sport in the schools, right? So the way of thinking would be the kids shouldn't be studying all the time. That would be excessive. But they also need time for play and recreation. You can see this in the quotes here. And then the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum says, a nice balance should be maintained between study time and recreation periods. That was a document that would influence all of these 800 Jesuit schools throughout the world. Okay, I think the approach of the document parallels Thomas's approach in interesting ways. So, for example, the document describes sport as a ludic activity that has its purpose in itself. You know? Now, that purpose can be put to other ends, right? Even the ends of an institution, if it's higher education, or money for professional athletes. And the character of play would be different at different levels. I think especially in the document, though, when it comes to youth sport, they emphasize this play dimension and element of it. But the other thing that the document does that parallels Thomas is to say that the end of sport is the human person and their well-being, you know, and flourishing. I would say this is countercultural in some ways. No? The end of sport is not money or fame or power, but it has to do with the human person and his or her development as a human being. So there's a kind of humanism, I would say, expressed in the document. John Paul II he's actually one of the first pope who really strongly emphasized this. The dignity of the person is the goal and criterion of all sporting activity. So he quotes in one of his talks a document that was provided at for the meeting, that sport is at the service of the person and not the person at the service of sport. Sport, the proper way of seeing things, a human being created in the image and likeness of God. Sport is not more important than the human. Sport needs to serve the human being in his or her integral development. Now, because the human being is social, that means that, according to the document, sport should foster the common good. You know? One of the most important ways in the United States, I think, that young people are introduced to the notion of the common good, right, which has to do with the conditions within which all people can flourish, is through playing on team sports. You know? They realize that they're part of something larger than themselves. Sport also is a place for encounter with people who are different than ourselves, as is reflected in Pope Francis's statement there, and can help to build the unity of the human family. You know, I think of someone like Bishop Scheel, who started the CYO in 1930 in Chicago, and how important that was in Chicago and then later in other parts of this country with respect to this theme. You know? These were kids from many different nationalities, come from different countries, different races. Girls and boys were participating in sports in the CYO at that time. It was really a context within which kids could encounter one another. So needed in our time, maybe more so now than any other time I've been alive. You know? And then the other theme that's brought forward is inclusion. So if it is true that sport can serve the human person in his or her flourishing and integral development, then all the kids that want to participate in sport should have a context opportunity for doing that. In our own context, unfortunately, as sport is getting more serious at younger and younger ages, and we have early specialization, you know, and viewing sport as a means to an end, so there's serious training year-round for many young people. We also have the other dynamic that's going on is a lot of young people are dropping out of sport. You know? And the top reason they give is that it's not fun anymore, you know, which is the reason that they wanted to play in the first place. So, but the other reality that I know Clark has done a lot of thinking about is the way in which pay to play, if you will. You know, that you need certain kind of resources even to participate often in youth sport today. And so children from lower income communities don't have the opportunity to participate in the same way, which also then negatively impacts them in the long term with respect to opportunities for sport later on. Okay, so the document and the statements of the popes provide us with general principles that sport should serve the human person, for example, even with respect to their spiritual lives. But they don't intend to tell us how sport does that or fails to do that. For that, actually, we need your help, right? Because you have experience, you're experts in this sense. But I think it's also good to get the help of scholars, especially those in the social sciences. I did my own doctoral studies with this man named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the author of the flow theory. And I think his research helps us to understand how playing sports is related to human well-being, growth, and even has a spiritual dimension to it. In his first publications, he pointed out that scholars hadn't taken play itself seriously. They limited their attention to play as a means to other ends. Interesting how even in academic, in scholarly work, play is being kind of overlooked, he's saying. What is this experience? They overlooked why it's enjoyable. What makes it play so enjoyable? And so he was interested in answering this question. He studied people involved in different kinds of autotelic activities in order to answer that question. Here's a quotation from a composer who's talking. So an autotelic activity is one that has its goal or its purpose in itself. That comes from the two Greek words. And so this composer says, one doesn't do it for the money. That's what I tell my students. Don't expect to make money. Don't expect fame or a pat on the back. Don't expect to do it because you love it. That would be an expression of an autotelic mentality. And Csikszentmihalyi makes a distinction. None of my titles are coming up at the top, so I'll have to tell you what they are. So this is enjoyment. He makes a distinction between pleasure and enjoyment. And maybe for our purposes, key to it would be, I can experience pleasure in activities that don't require much investment on my part. I can go to the food center here on campus and get a carton of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, a spoon. If I just have a couple dollars, eat that, it's going to be a very pleasurable experience if I'm inside and it's warm. But if a psychologist is asking me about the most rewarding experiences of my life 10 years from now, I'm probably not going to mention eating that ice cream, right? It also doesn't lead to our growth, pleasurable experiences. This is not to get down on pleasure. We need pleasure in life, right? Entirely. But the distinction between pleasure and enjoyment, Csikszentmihalyi would say, pleasure doesn't require much investment on my part, also doesn't lead to my growth in significant ways. Enjoyment, on the other hand, he says, we experience when we put ourselves, the whole of ourselves, into an activity. And we go beyond where we were in some way that was meaningful. We push the envelope, no? So he says, for example, playing a close game of tennis that stretches one's ability is enjoyable, as is reading a book that reveals things in a new light, as is having a conversation that leads us to express ideas we didn't know we had. After these kind of experiences, we tend to, that was fun, no? And we tend to want to do them again. So some of the elements of what he would come to call flow experiences are the following, and it looks like my headings aren't coming up there. First one is centering of attention. So people describe experiences where they're centering their attention on a limited stimulus field, right? Their focus is completely on what they're doing. Here's a high school basketball player. The court, that's all that matters. This is coming from Csikszentmihalyi's research. Sometimes on the court I think of a problem and I think that's nothing compared to the game. Kids my age, they think a lot, but when you're playing basketball, that's all there is on your mind, just basketball. Now sport activities require this of us, young people, everyone. Here's John Brody, San Francisco 49er quarterback, my generation, says a player's effectiveness is directly related to his ability to be right there, doing that thing in the moment. He can't be worrying about the past or the future or the crowd. He has to be right in what it is that he's doing. So another way of describing this is there's a merging of action and awareness. So what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about become one and the same thing, which is often not the case in ordinary life. One is very aware of one's actions. We're so immersed in what we're doing, very aware of one's actions, but not of the awareness itself. All of our attention is devoted to what it is that we're engaged in. So this element is egolessness. So because I'm completely focused on what I'm doing, I don't have attention left over to also be explicitly thinking about myself, in that self-conscious sort of way. So if this young girl is bringing the ball up at the end of a tie game, let's say in basketball, she has a lot of things to pay attention to. She knows what the score is. She has how much time is left on the clock. What kind of defense is the other team playing? What play did the coach call? Who has the hot hand on my team? She has a lot. And so in order to do that well, she has to be completely attending to that. And she can't also be entertaining other thoughts, such as, what does my dad think about how I'm playing today? Or will we be popular if we win this game? Those kind of thoughts that go this way. Okay, so now, while during this flow experience I'm not thinking about myself, afterwards I do have attention available to reflect on my experience. And often if it's a flow experience that's really life-giving, I'm more aware of my own gifts, and I'm more aware also of the way in which I'm connected to I make a contribution to the group. The way Csikszentmihalyi describes this is, when we're not preoccupied with ourselves, we actually have a chance to expand the concept of who we are. Loss of self-consciousness can lead to self-transcendence, to a feeling that the boundaries of our being have been pushed forward. So another thing that people describe is a sense of union with one's surroundings. So if these experiences are happening when climbing a mountain, it could be a sense of union with the created world. If they're happening playing music, if I'm the guitar player, a sense of union with the bass player and the drummer. And in sports, especially in team sports, it's the bond, union that we experience with the other members of the team. Phil Jackson says, the struggle every group leader faces, is how to get members of the team who are driven by the quest for individual glory to give themselves over wholeheartedly to the group effort. In other words, how to teach them selflessness. So in team sports, that egolessness and union with surroundings are kind of flip sides of the same coin. So another thing that's described by people is a sense of effortlessness. This is maybe where the word flow comes from. It feels like I'm being carried along by a current. Things are just flowing along. But for Csikszentmihalyi High, this kind of effortlessness is preceded by discipline and practice. So if you think of a girl in the 8th grade, let's start, she's in the 7th grade, and she's right-handed, and she's playing basketball. And she realizes she needs to learn how to shoot a left-handed layup, that she doesn't know how to do. So initially she has to listen to the coach and try to remember, what did he say to me? What foot do I jump off of? And how should I be holding my arm? And then she has to practice it a lot. Through the summer, she's running into the garage door. She keeps having to think about it. It doesn't come naturally initially. But then, once she has done that for a long enough time, let's say she gets a pass on a breakaway at the end of her 8th grade year, and then she's able to shoot this left-handed layup as though she's been doing it her whole life. There's a kind of ease or effortlessness to it. Now, Csikszentmihalyi High points out that what's really important when it comes to young people, for them to be able to put themselves into enjoyable activities, is that they have a sense of security, and that they know that they're loved and accepted. So he says here, if not, basically I won't read the entire quote, but if not, what happens is that their attention goes to that issue. He says at the end, he'd be so worried about keeping his sense of self from coming apart as to have little energy to pursue intrinsic rewards. Right? Another author named Lynn Belayev writes about how when we have a sense of ontological security, she calls it, which would be the rightness of our existence, that this is related to our ability to play. Then we're free to play. So these are characteristics of flow activities. I was doing elements of flow experiences. Characteristics of flow activities would be that there's a balance between challenges and skills. So in this diagram, it's the letter C in the middle, where the skills and challenges are about even. That is the flow, the flow channel. We had a ping pong table in my basement when I was growing up. And the most enjoyable games of ping pong were the ones where the volley was the longest. And I think the reason why that was the case is because myself and my 10-year-old companion were pushing each other, that kind of, right, pushing the envelope. We're right at the edge of our skill level, and it's very exhilarating. That's when we're getting better, and also it's enjoyable. So I think as coaches, we could. This is a very useful thing to think about. How can we structure practices or even participation in games in such a way that the kids are presented with challenges that are at their skill levels, both individually and as a team, so that what participating is both enjoyable and it also is leading to their improvement in the sport. So another characteristic of flow activities would be that there are clear goals and immediate feedback, which would be obvious in the case of sport. Because it's clear what the goal is. The goal is to win the game. But also coaches play an important role in this regard, as the pictures illustrate now, in terms of giving feedback to young people about how we're doing. Okay. So flow in Christian spirituality. One of the reasons I was initially interested in flow theory came out of my experience of making the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. There's a meditation in the middle called the Two Standards meditation, and he has the retreat and consider how human beings get off track, even societies, when they become ensnared, so unfree, if you will, by riches, so wealth, which leads to the honor of this world and to what he calls surging pride, which would be this kind of, I can look down on people who don't have what I do. He says, consider and reflect, this is how we get off track. So what I see in the flow experiences is people describing life when they're free of that. They're free of that. They're operating from a different place. Remember our composer? One doesn't do it for the money. That's what I tell my students. Don't expect to make money. Don't expect fame or a pat on the back. Don't expect a damn thing. Do it because you love it. He's operating out of a deeper, right, a deeper place. Now, Phil Jackson would agree with Ignatius of Loyola. Jackson points out, whether they're willing to acknowledge it or not, what drives most basketball players is not the money or the adulation, but their love of the game. They live for moments when they can lose themselves completely in the action and experience the pure joy of competition. One of the main jobs of a coach, he says, is to reawaken that spirit. Interesting, no? Coming from a coach who, one of the most successful coaches at the highest level, where there's the most money and fame involved, he says, one of the main jobs of a coach is to reconnect players with their love of the game. Okay. So with respect to our own faith tradition and the issue of ontological security, we have a very profound resource, no? The notion that God is love. Here's a quotation from Hugo Rahner. A person who has faith and truly loves God is also the person who can truly play. For only one who is secure in God can be truly light of heart. I might adjust that a little bit and say, the person who has faith and truly knows that she or he is loved by God, you know, when we're thinking about young people, is the young person who can truly play. You know? So we believe and confess that God is love. You know? Does this experience, this is reality, do we know that ourselves in our own lives? No? And is that a reality that permeates our families, our churches, our communities, the teams that we coach, so that the kids are also picking up on this, that they're first accepted, loved, and respected? Now, one of the other connections that I saw between flow and Christian spirituality is in Ignatius of Loyola's notion of spiritual consolation. Okay? For Ignatius, in the life of a person who's trying to grow, trying to go from good to better, not that the person's perfect, but that's the general orientation of their life, they'll experience God's presence in spiritual consolation, he calls it. And just like flow experiences are related to the growth of the person, so too experiences of spiritual consolation are related to the growth of the person. So he writes, the good angel acts for the progress of the soul so that it may grow and rise from what is good to what is better. One of the characteristics of experience of spiritual consolation, just the way person, how do we know we're experiencing God's presence? He says, if we're trying to grow, it's characteristic of God to give genuine happiness and spiritual joy. I was reminded of the short little parable that Jesus tells, that the kingdom of heaven, which is at the center of his life, it's preaching the reign of God, the kingdom of heaven, is like a treasure buried in a field, which a person finds and hides again. And out of joy, he sells all that he has and goes to buy that field. There's an indication there that this whole following of Jesus and his whole way of life springs from this sense of joy and what one has found. As the Father's loved me, so I have loved you. Remain in my love, he tells his disciples. And he says, I tell you these things so that my joy may be in you, and your joy may be complete. And from a Christian perspective, even suffering doesn't extinguish this. No? When he tells at the end of his life, you grieve now, but you will rejoice. I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy away from you. So another connection with flow and these experiences of spiritual consolation is effortlessness. So Ignatius says, the experience of God's presence in the life of a person who's trying to grow, to go from good to better, is gentle and easy. It's like a drop of water falling into a sponge. You know? Or it's like coming into your own house through an open door. And what's happening here is, theologically, small letter S spirit, human spirit, is syncing up with the Holy Spirit. I'm going in the direction the Holy Spirit wants me to go. And so it feels like I'm coming into my own house through an open door. However, for Ignatius, just like for Csikszentmihalyi, this experience of effortlessness is preceded by discipline. You know? So it's the spiritual exercises. You know? So one has to reflect on the life of Christ, reflect on my own life, pray, do the Ignatian prayer, 5 hours a day if you're making the 30-day retreat, come to know who Jesus is, and then over time, one develops a sensitivity to God's Spirit, and there's this kind of ease to it, as though you're being carried along, and you can recognize that. Now, for Ignatius, this is maybe important for our young people too. The major decisions we make in life, he says, should be related to and building on experiences of spiritual consolation, because that's when we have a felt sense of the presence of the Spirit leading us in our lives. So I often tell my students, pay attention. What kind of classes give you joy? What kind of classes are you experiencing these kind of elements? So maybe is it possible that through experiences of flow and some of the elements that we've described, that young people can be introduced even to this phenomenon, the way God is present in their lives and the way God is leading them, so that as they get older, they can recognize it. They have an experiential basis. It resonates with them. They can reference back to their own experience. I emphasize this with my students at Seattle University who've played sports. The importance of that, because I try to tell them, look, you don't have to just pretend as though all of that didn't happen and now go on to your next life. But you actually have resources within the experience of participating in sport, joy, giving yourself over to something larger than yourself, a sense of rightness, ease, that you can look for now in your life, right, and see where is this pointing me in terms of the kind of what I want to major in, what kind of work I want to do. So if we look real deeply into youth sport as play, in other words, I want to notice what we've done. We're taking seriously the experience itself, the activity itself. Maybe we can start to understand how it is affecting young people's minds and their spirit, small letter S, spirit, human spirit, that links them up to the Holy Spirit. How it is a form of gymnastics of the body and spirit, as John Paul II calls it in the document. Athletic activity, in fact, he says, highlights not only the person's valuable physical abilities, but also his intellectual and spiritual capacities. It is not just physical strength and muscular efficiency, but it also has a soul and must show its complete face. Thank you.